Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Today, as part of the 2021 virtual Sacramento Archives Crawl, the Yolo County Archives will be hosting a presentation from Floyd Shimomura with Emily Masuda titled Preserving Perseverance, the Japanese American Community of Winters. This presentation is adapted from an exhibition that is currently on display at the Winters Museum and will discuss the ways in which the history of the Japanese American community of Winters has been preserved over the years. Floyd and Emily will be highlighting archival records, family collections, and the role of retelling historical narratives to younger generations. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that this virtual program is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have sown worldwide. Yolo County is on the traditional unceded territory of the Occidental Winton Nation. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. Floyd Shimomura grew up in Winters and is third-generation Japanese American. He was educated at UC Davis, including its law school. During his legal career, he served as a state attorney and administrative law judge in Sacramento and a law professor at UC Davis. He also served as the national president of the Japanese American Citizens League in the 1980s. He is now retired and enjoys travel and volunteer work. Emily Masuda has taught English as a Japanese exchange and teaching program in Gifu, Japan, and at Winters High School. Her involvement with the Historical Society of Winters began when she reached out about teaching the history of the Japanese families to her high school students. Luckily, the Historical Society was working on an exhibit for the Winters Museum about this lost Japanese community. Having a strong interest in telling stories, real and imagined, she volunteers for the museum and as co-director of the Stories on Stage Davis, and is currently a graduate student in the MFA program in creative writing at UC Davis. Lastly, before we get started, I wanted to remind you all to ask questions at any time using the chat function down at the bottom of the screen. And we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So thank you so much for joining us again, and I will pass it over to Floyd to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Heather. I guess you can put up the first slide. Okay, this is the name of our presentation, Preserving Perseverance, the Lost Japanese American Community of Winters. Next slide. Okay, this slide shows the exhibit at the Winters Museum titled The Lost Japanese Community of Winters. It spans about 100 years from 1888, when the first Japanese arrived in Winters, until 1988, when their descendants helped achieve redress for the unjust incarceration after Pearl Harbor. It is a purely local history with all the photos, artifacts, and stories directly related to the Japanese who lived in Winters. Next slide. Okay, the first part really focuses in on the Issei, and I'm focusing in on the first settler. In this brief presentation, we will only focus on about three matters. First, finding the first Japanese settlers in the 1890s. Second, the recovery of a 1930 Japanese school photograph. And third, Emily will talk about my involvement in redress in the 1980s. Okay, let's start with how we found our first settler next. Well, I did a little research, and there's a book called The Issei by Yuji Ichioka. And on page 80 of his book, he made the surprising statement. The Japanese entered California agriculture in 1888 when a few student laborers worked as field hands in winters near Vacaville. Next slide. Well, I know we have a lot of archivists on hand today, and like any good researcher, I wanted to check Mr. Ichioka's authority for that statement, because I never was aware, even though I grew up in Winters, that Winters was the first place where Japanese farm labor actually began. And so I looked at the Winters Express dated May 12th, 1888. Now that's the local newspaper here in Winters. And this is what it said. And I think this is what Ichioka was relying on. He said that after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a number of Winters growers, notably the Brink brothers and G.W. Thistle, had employed Japanese help and are satisfied with the experiment so far as they have gone. So in 1888, the Brink brothers had an experiment going, and they brought in some Japanese workers. Next slide. So let's begin with the Brink brothers. What kind of farming were they up to? Well, it turns out that in 1888, the same year that they did this experiment, bringing in Japanese workers, a professor at Berkeley wrote a book about the Vacaville Winters Early Fruit District of California. And what he said was, it was a very unique area from a agricultural standpoint, because its fruit, like apricots, peaches, and whatnot, ripened about a month earlier than any other fruit in the state of California. And that the Winters area, which is the northern part of the Vaca Valley area, was the earliest of all by maybe 4 or 5 days. And he attributed that to the fact that Vacaville and Winters were in an area where the ocean breezes from the Bay Area collide with the warmer breezes from the Sacramento Valley, and the confluence of that in and out motion creates a special ecosystem. Next slide. The next question is, okay, we know about the Brink brothers, but what about these student laborers that Ichioka talked about? Where do they come from? Well, it turns out that there was a person named Waichiro Honda in the Wakayama prefecture of Japan, who was encouraging students to come to Sacramento and San Francisco to learn more about the United States and American culture. And he said that the best way to do that was to work as a houseboy, like in San Francisco, where you could live in, do your domestic duties during the day, and take classes at night. And so it was really from this group of students who the Brink brothers ended up recruiting for their 1888 experiment. And later statistics shows that by 1895, 7 years later, there were 450 Japanese residing in the Baca Valley area, 80% from Wakayama. And from this statistic, I think Ichioka makes the connection between the student laborers coming from Wakayama and the Brink brothers. And even up until World War II, 80% of the Japanese in the Winters area was from Wakayama, and in fact, from two very small villages. Next slide. So when we put up the lost exhibit in June, the earliest Japanese immigrants we could identify arrived in 1898, 10 years after the Brink brothers experiment. In fact, my maternal grandfather was one of those who arrived in 1898, and his name was Toyokichi Uenishi. But what about that 10-year gap between the 1888 experiment and the arrival of my grandparents and his friends 10 years later? I think the question was the Brink brothers experiment a one and done, but nothing really flowed from that particular episode? So what happened? And in this, and then this is when something extraordinary happened. You know, we put up the lost exhibit in June, and at that time we had a reception, and one of the former residents named Yasuko Takahashi said that, hey, she had some photographs that she would like to share with us. And so she scanned some photos and sent them in. And this is one of them. And she said that in this picture, her grandfather, who became known as George Takahashi, is the gentleman standing in front of the wagon towards the middle. And the Japanese woman is named Asano Takahashi and is his wife. So, you know, we got back to Yasuko and we asked her, well, who were these, the white folks in the photograph? And she said she didn't know. And then we asked her, when was the photograph taken? And she said she didn't really know. So that kind of made me think at that point, hey, you know, maybe this is the Brink brothers. And so I did some research, and from the mountains and background, I knew it was from the Apricot district west of Winters, because in the lithograph that I just showed, you know, it clearly shows the Berryessa Gap. I also knew it was taken in June because of the apricots drying on the trays in the background. You can't see it in this photograph, but they're just in front of the horses. It's a little bit dark on my screen, but you can see it in the real photograph. Finally, I knew that electricity came to Winters in 1905, and so that electrical pole indicates that this photograph must have been taken after that date. So who were the people? Could they be the Brink brothers? After checking the 1910 census, I discovered that August Brink, the younger of the two brothers, had three young daughters of grammar school age named Elise, Pearl, and Grace. Now this was in the 1910 census. Bingo, it must be the Brink brothers, I thought. Looking more at the 1900 census, 10 years before that, I learned that George Takahashi had arrived in 1892, had learned English, and was essentially the foreman of the Brink brothers ranch. And the big thing to me was that he had learned English already, because it's well known that it was the farm laborers who learned English. They were the ones who became foremen, because they could negotiate and speak to the white growers, and also recruit and select the best Japanese workers. And so initially I thought that based on all this information, this photograph was taken in 1908 or so. But then I learned that Asano, Yasuko's grandmother, had returned to Japan in 1907, a year earlier, and had her first child in December of 1907. So I became convinced that this picture was actually taken in 1907 in June. And in Japanese American history, 1907 is a significant year because it is the year when the Gentleman's Agreement was signed, which stopped further immigration of Japanese farm labor in the US. And so that made me wonder, and the other thing that was unusual about this picture is that Asano herself was even there, because prior to 1907, like 95% of the Japanese farm workers were young males. There really were no women, and the 5% that were women, I think were there more to entertain the young men than anything else. So Asano was probably one of the first married woman to come to Winters. The other thing that was astounding about this picture is that it's a picture that shows both the Japanese workers as well as the white growers and their families all in one photograph. I am also on the collections committee for the National Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles, and quarterly, I'm part of a review team that makes a decision or recommendation on whether things should be accepted by the museum for its collection. And I've never seen a photograph like this from that time period. One, because there's a married woman in it, but also because it's taken together with both the growers and the laborers at the same time. And then it suddenly dawned on me, 1907, and this is really because when I showed this to Emily, who will be coming on soon, I mentioned that I thought maybe it was in 1907 now. And she was the one who said, oh, that's when the Gentleman's Agreement was signed. And that's when the light bulb went on. This photograph was obviously taken by a professional photographer. And, the Brink brothers were always very innovative. I mean, that's why they did the experiment in 1888 with the Japanese student workers. And they knew that now the Japanese labor force was going to be cut off, just like the Chinese labor force got cut off in 1882. But they were also aware that there was a exception to the ban, and that was that if a Japanese laborer had a wife, the wife was permitted to join the husband in the United States. So I'm pretty sure, and this is speculation on my part, but because this picture is so unusual, that this photograph was taken maybe 5 or 6 months before Asano went back to Japan to have her baby, and was in effect used as a recruiting tool to encourage more Japanese women from their villages in Wakayama to come to the United States, because that would ensure that the existing labor force of young men would remain in the Winters area to work, and also settle down. So that was the purpose of this particular photograph. Next slide. But in order to verify this, I talked to Heather at Yolo Archives to check the property records to see where the Brink Brothers Ranch was, to see if it corresponded to the photograph. And if you look at this photograph, the city of Winters is kind of on the right-hand side under the 1900 designation. And the Brink Brothers Ranch is in the middle bottom part of the photograph, and it shows that they had 197 acres. And that's exactly where that photograph would have been taken if it was on the Brink Brothers Ranch. Next slide. So we found our first pioneers, George and Asano Takahashi. And this photograph on the right was taken in 1924. And in the middle, you can see George Takahashi, and to his left, Asano, his wife. And then the younger boy was named after his father, and was basically George Jr. And the person on the right was named Frank. And Frank is the father of Yasko, who supplied the photograph. So I think we've done a pretty good preliminary examination, and has kind of verified the origin and significance of that picture. And we were able to actually identify and find our first pioneer family in Winters. Sometimes they say, if you build it, they will come. And I have that same feeling about our exhibit this year, is that the exhibit itself generated more information, more photographs. And this was the pleasant surprise that we received. Next slide. Next, I'm going to move on to part 2 and focus in on a photograph that we uncovered of the Japanese school that was built in 1930. Okay, so now it's about 29 years later or so, after the 1907 picture. And it looks like, if my supposition is right, Asano's mission to go back to her villages in Wakayama was successful, because about 30 years later, or 20 years later, this is what the Japanese American community in Winters looked like. And The thing that's surprising about this photograph, first of all, is that it exists at all. And the reason is that because of that Japanese flag that appears in the middle of the picture. Because the picture was taken in 1930, but about 11 years later, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was just mass hysteria on the West Coast, and the FBI was going around arresting anyone who they thought was disloyal. And so I know people in the Japanese American community, they burnt tragically, books and letters and photographs and anything that had Japanese writing on it, because these FBI agents, could not read Japanese. And if they saw something with Japanese writing on it, they thought it was a suspicious item. So obviously a picture with the Japanese flag on it was probably one of the first things that went into the fire at that period. And as archivists, you can feel the tragedy of all that important family and community history that was lost in those months right after Pearl Harbor. Now, so the question is, why did this one survive? Okay, if you look at the picture of the family at the bottom of the slide, that's my grandfather and father, Itaru Shimomura, and my father, Ben Shimomura, are the two males in the middle. And my grandmother is Sawano. She's to the far left. But the woman to the far right is her younger sister. Now, her younger sister returned to Japan in 1933, 3 years after this photograph was taken, to be married to someone in Wakayama. And when she went back, she took this photograph with her. So the reason why this photograph survived World War II was it wasn't in the United States at all. It was back in Wakayama. And in about 1980, my dad visited Wakayama on a trip, and this photograph was given to him, and it was brought back to the Winters area. But I didn't know about this until about 5 years ago when I was going through some of my mother's photographs after she passed away. And I was really amazed when I saw this photograph, and knew immediately what its historic value was. And now it's has been safely given to Heather at the Yolo Archives, and I think she'll take good care of it. Next slide. Yeah, the thing is that a picture like this reminds us that there's a lot of official paperwork that go into building the school. And one of them is, you have to buy property. And one of the mysteries is of the school is how could the community build a school like that when the Japanese were prohibited from owning real property? Well, we did a little bit more research, and we found out that no Japanese individual bought the property, but it was purchased by a corporate entity. And that corporation was called Kokugo Gakuen, and it was incorporated in 1929. Next slide. And it was incorporated as a nonprofit corporation. And if you look at its articles of incorporation, one of the first things that it says is that the undersigned people who established it were citizens of the United States, okay? And so they were adults, and so that they could do an incorporation. And so it's no coincidence that the incorporation happened in 1929, because after Asano went back to Wakayama in 1907, all of a sudden women from her village started coming to Winters, through the loophole in the gentleman's agreement. And sure enough, some of the first Nisei children were born in 1909 and 1908, that period. And so in 1929, those children would have become 21 years old. They were American citizens, and now they're legal adults. Immediately now, they could use the system, the American legal system, fully as American citizens and as adults. Next slide. Well, so the school was constructed, but as we said, as most of you know, that after Pearl Harbor, all the Japanese on the West Coast, including in Winters, were forcibly removed and put in concentration camps in the interior of the country. And they're only permitted to take what they could carry, because they were put on trains and there was no baggage cars for them. And so this is a photograph of some of the trunks that my parents left and stored in the Japanese school. And because that was the only place that they could really keep them in Winters, although the Vasey brothers allowed the Japanese to store things in their old opera house that they owned. They were very kind. Next slide. Also, after Pearl Harbor, the Yolo County District Attorney sent out this questionnaire. And this is another thing that Heather at Yolo Archives found, that I never knew this existed. But the questionnaire was sent to all Japanese in the county that occupied property. And the Japanese school obviously occupied property. So they had to fill out the questionnaire. Now, the questionnaire had maybe about 20 questions on it, but question 4 asked whether the property was near any strategic works. And, the answer was, well, we're right across the street from the city's waterworks. But then they had this footnote and they wanted to explain that. And they said that since the 10th of December, 1941, that was 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese school board of directors had shut down the school, and it hasn't been used for any purpose whatsoever after that. And that it would be closed for the duration of the war, except that when the city of Winters, American Red Cross, or similar organization may put it to some worthy use. And signed by George Tanago, the Secretary Treasurer. Next slide. Well, sure enough, something happens that sometimes makes you regret that you wrote something down when maybe you didn't have to volunteer it. But on January 8th, 1943, 7 months after persons had been incarcerated, Winters High School burnt down. Okay, and Winters High School needed some place to function. And the old Japanese school was only about 2 blocks away, just east of the burnt building, on the other side of the railroad tracks in the industrial area. So the Japanese school was commandeered and renamed Victory High School and used for several years after the war. And no rent was ever paid for that. Next slide. But in order to use the Japanese school, they had to do something with all the baggage and property and things that were being stored there. So the school district decided to send all the property to the owners who were in these concentration camps. Now, the Winters people were sent to 2 different camps. Those on the Yolo County side, north of Pewter Creek, like my parents, were sent to Granada, which is in Colorado. And those that lived south of Pewter Creek in Solano County were sent to Arizona into Gila River. Next slide. So this trunk to the left is on display at the Winters Museum currently, and with little explanations for how it got there and how it was stored in the old Winters Japanese school. And you could see the family number written on the side, 30980. And that was written by the school district so that it would get to the right person in Colorado. And so here's a picture of my father at the Granada camp. And this is where they sent the trunk. So I asked my father recently, because he's 100 years old and still alive and still alert mentally. If you heard about the Winters High School burning down, because I didn't know about that till about 4 or 5 years ago myself. And he said, yeah, I heard about it. We heard about it. We read about it in the Winters Express. And I said, well, what did you think? And he said, I thought, well, I guess that they can't blame that one on us. And I guess being 1,000 miles away in Colorado behind barbed wire was a pretty good alibi. The other thing is, I said, well, weren't you happy that you had to leave all your stuff behind, but now the school's just sent it to you? And again, he said, well, it actually was pretty much useless. He says, because what was in the trunk was, first of all, a lot of cooking things, pots and pans, but then very nice dishes and things that his mother had. But he said, we ate in a mess hall, so it was useless to us. And secondly, there were some really nice kimono and Japanese clothes and suits from his father. But he said, they're all fancy clothes, but there was no place to wear it to in the camp because there's no fancy occasions. He said, if we had worn any of that clothes, people would just laugh at us. So he said, all that trunk did was made me feel sad. And I said, why sad? And he said, well, it made me feel like they had just kicked us out of Winters 7 months ago, and now they don't want us to come back. And that surprised me, that answer. But then I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, that would kind of be like going to college and 7 months later opening up your dorm room and seeing all the stuff that you left in your bedroom piled up in front of your door. You get the feeling that maybe home wasn't still home for you anymore. So the story of the Japanese school and the trunk ended up being kind of a sad story. And part of the reason why out of the 100 or 275 people who were taken to the camps from the Winters area, 80% of them never returned, and the 20% and only 20% did. So I was fortunate that people like, the Brink brothers actually were, as well as the Tufts and some of the other growers, they allowed my parents to come back and resume farming. But for many of the others, the other 80%, they weren't quite so lucky. But I don't want to blame the school district people because I don't think they intended to send a message like that. But in that kind of environment, that's the message that was received. Okay, with that, I think I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Floyd. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the Sansei, the third generation, and their efforts during the redress movement. This took place in the 1980s. And so redress was when the third generation of Japanese Americans was seeking compensation for the wrong done to their families and maybe even themselves. If they were in the camps, they would have been really young because of the incarceration. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start with Floyd. So Floyd had a really important role in the redress movement, and we are going to be highlighting him and his contributions, but we do want to acknowledge that it was a team effort. But one reason Floyd was very involved was because he became, in 1982, at age 34, the first Sansei national president of the JACL. So the JACL is the Japanese American Citizens League. It's a civil rights organization, a lot like the NAACP, but for Japanese Americans. And prior to him becoming president, there had only been Nisei, second generation people who had this role. So it was a changing of the guard. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about why he was elected president. One reason was because he was a law professor and he was an expert in specifically how to obtain money damages from the US government. So the JACL at the time was pursuing monetary redress for the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And Floyd had the perfect background, the ideal background to serve as president. So this is an article he wrote on the history of claims against the United States, looking at those monetary claims all the way from colonial times to the then present in the 1980s. And to write this article, he conducted 3 years of archival research. He did this at the Shields Library here on the campus of UC Davis, and you can see a picture of it on the bottom right-hand corner. So during the 1980s, there were a series of meetings that happened, kind of building momentum for the movement. One of the first meetings was in Tokyo. This was a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone in 1983. So a few days later, well, Floyd was meeting with President Nakasone, but in a few days, President Reagan was supposed to visit and address the Japanese parliament. So Prime Minister Nakasone turned to Floyd and said, "Is there anything you'd like me to say to President Reagan?" And Floyd said, "Yes, please ask the president to sign, to consider the legislation, the redress legislation that was at that time being introduced to Congress." And according to President Reagan's legislative files, which were released about 10 years later, Prime Minister Nakasone did bring this up with President Reagan and lobbied him to sign the redress bill. And this is a photograph from, I believe, a newspaper where Floyd, along with the JACL's John Tateishi and Min Yasui, he's testifying before Congress. So this was the year after meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan, so in 1984. And then a few months later, he also, in the next slide, he met with top White House officials. So you can see him here in the West Wing of the White House. He's meeting here with Jack Spahn. This is President Reagan's domestic policy advisor. And they discussed the Japanese American redress legislation, and Floyd asked the president to support it. And then 4 years later, President Reagan does sign the redress bill. So that's August 8th, 1988. It's a big day. And what that legislation provided was an apology and $20,000 in compensation to each Japanese American person who was incarcerated in the camps during World War II. So it was a success. And then jumping forward to 2017, so Floyd's redress papers and autographed bills were put into the Smithsonian Archives. So you can see here the autographed bills. Those are autographed by Senators Inoue and Matsunaga and by Representatives Mineta and Matsui. So those were the 4 Japanese American members of Congress at the time. And then on the left, you can see Smithsonian curators pictured here. So that's Jennifer Locke Jones and Noriko Sanefuji with the National Museum of American History. You can also see Floyd's family at the exhibit. They had an exhibit similar to the one that Winters has currently. And this is Floyd standing quite proudly in front of the Smithsonian. And here's that picture of Floyd again in front of the Smithsonian, but I want to take us back to 1966 for a moment. This is also a picture of Floyd. He's the person standing off to the left. He was just elected Youth Day Mayor by his peers in Winters when he was attending Winters High School. And this is his Youth Day City Council. So those are also students. So Youth Day, just to give a little context, is a day where the students become the elected officials of the town for the day. And there's a parade, lots of festivities. But you can see here, Floyd, elected president, he's already very politically active. And what this has shown is not only had Winters and other communities shed the prejudices and fears that were very much alive during World War II, but someone from a small town can make a big difference in the world. And I think Floyd serves as an inspiration to us all. So with that being said, I learned about Floyd and I thought, wow, there's a celebrity hidden in our community. And we wanted to invite him when I was a teacher at Winters High School last year to come give a presentation to our sophomore students who were studying World War II at the time in their history classes. So we invited him to come to campus via Zoom, and he gave a wonderful presentation, some of the information that he presented here. He also talked about his family background and his part in the redress movement, and it was very inspiring for our students. And it was our way of persevering perseverance in the community. So to give you a taste of what that was like, I've included the thank you notes that students wrote Floyd after the presentation. So I've included 4 here today, and I'll read parts of them for you. So this student said, "Thank you very much for taking the time to talk about what happened to your father. It was very neat how you were able to tell us all that happened and showed us amazing pictures. We learned so much about the history of Winters and your family and the time you were here with us. I wanted to say thank you for teaching us things about Winters and your family. Without this, we wouldn't have known about the community made here and all the hard work your father did. Thank you again for enlightening us with the rich past of your family and our town Winters." Another student wrote something similar, saying, "Thank you for coming to our school, sharing your story. I appreciate you being able to tell such a hard life story. We as people can use this information to inform others about the past so we don't make the same mistakes. My class has been learning a lot about World War II, and hearing your story has expanded my understanding of the time. Thank you so much for taking the time to come share your experience with us." Another student said that it gave them a better understanding of discrimination issues, and said, "I understand that it is not easy to speak out about rough experiences. Listening to you made World War II feel more real. We weren't reading it out of a history book. It was an eye-opener. As a future generation, I will stand up for others and make sure history doesn't repeat itself. Thank you for your time." And then just one more. And this student said, "Thank you for taking time out of your day to describe a very sensitive time. We appreciate the strength and great storytelling. Not everyone has had the privilege we had on Wednesday. We have been learning about World War II, and I appreciate you taking the time to inform us more." So he got many of these thank you notes, and we really did appreciate you coming to our class, Floyd. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to mention is what I'm working on outside of teaching. I'm also a writer, and I'm also volunteering with the Historical Society of Winters. And what I'm doing is trying to preserve these stories as well. So the exhibit for the museum, it's temporary, it'll come down at some point. And I would like to help preserve it through a book project. So I'm working right now on taking digitized files and the captions and compiling it into a book that we will print out and have available for the community. And then I also do write fiction. I am a creative writer in a graduate program on the UC Davis campus, and I can see great potential for historical fiction. Nothing yet, but it's something that I'd like to pursue at some point. And I do want to finally add that Floyd has really inspired me to do some of my own research about my family background. I'm Nisei second generation. I don't have roots in Yolo County, but I do want to do some digging about my own family and hopefully uncover some more history. So thank you. And I will pass it over to Heather.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily and Floyd. That was fantastic.
Down to 42 now.
Oh, I'm gonna mute. Yes, thank you so much for your time and your presentation. It was so wonderful to hear about the different ways that you're helping to preserve the story of the Japanese American community in Winters. I think it's a testament to archives, but also a testament to the collecting and preservation abilities of family members. And it's great that you're able to share those stories with the younger generation, with students, so that they can understand not only what happened nationally, but what's happened in their own communities that they live in today. So thank you so much again. At this time, if any of you have questions for Emily or Floyd, feel free to type them into the chat. I do have a couple of questions while we're waiting for other people to formulate their questions and send them our way. And then also, Emily, I think you need to leave in about 5 or 10 minutes. So if Emily leaves, we can still stay, and Floyd and I will field questions. So just in case you see Emily pop off of the presentation, she's got a class to go to. I wanted to talk a little bit as since this is kind of part of the archives crawl, and also as the archivist kind of in the room. I was curious, Floyd, if you could chat a little bit about the process of getting your papers into the Smithsonian. I think that's really exciting, and I'm curious to hear about how that happened.
Yeah, I think the secret is that you have to know, but you have to know someone who already works there, who is like your advocate. Okay, I guess you can just send them stuff and hope that they'll take it. But in my case, I met Noriko, who there was a picture of her at a JCL convention about 4 or 5 years ago, and she was putting together this exhibit uh, for the Smithsonian. And but her focus was on World War II and also on the 442nd. Uh, and so she was going around at the convention and to other places trying to collect things for her exhibit. And I happened to be sitting next to her at a dinner, and she asked me if I had anything, and I said, you know, I was born after World War II, so I don't have any experiences or anything about the internment. But that I was involved in the redress campaign, and so we talked about that for a few minutes, and she said, well, we don't plan to focus in on the redress, but why don't you send me some stuff and we'll um, see what we can do with it. So I sent her a couple boxes of all my papers when I was National JCL president, as well as the signed redress bills and other things, and some photographs we had, and I asked her if she wanted me to just send her redress stuff, and she said, no, send me everything, you know, all the agendas from your meetings. And I said, well, you know, we just talk about other things like our scholarship program or our budget or membership or youth program. And, you know, that has really nothing directly related to redress in it. And she said, don't worry about that. She said, 100 years from now, people are not only, they'll know what happened in redress, but they're going to wonder how a little organization like yours was able to do it without hiring any fancy lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. And that, so they would be interested in all the little intricacies of your organization. So, so that's what I did. And 6 months later, all of this was accepted. And I thought that that was an awful long time. And after about, you know, the first month or two, I kept checking my email and everything, but never heard anything. So I thought, well, maybe it just got lost or they're going to reject it or something. And, but later on, I talked to one of my colleagues, former colleagues at the law school. And when I said it took 6 months, he said, that's fast. So, and I think the reason is that they have an elaborate process in the Smithsonian. And so, you know, you may have an advocate, but they have to go through a couple different committees, and it's pretty thoroughly reviewed. So I don't think I really appreciated how valuable those old papers were that I had in my garage. But I'm glad I didn't throw them away, because I talked to a few other national presidents, and because I told them about this, and they said, oh, we should have saved our papers, but you know, we threw them away because, you know, they moved 2 or 3 times since the campaign was over. So, but you know, for archivists, I think this is what you're looking for, is actual documents that were written and prepared in time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's wonderful that you had that advocate and that connection to the Smithsonian, because it's true. I mean, some of the things that you've created in your life, and I'm speaking to everybody in the room, you may not think that it has historic value, but it very well could. And especially, I think, I mean, the work that you did was extraordinary, and obviously it needed to be preserved. But I think sometimes it's good to have a second opinion and have somebody else look at your stuff and see if there's value there. Because I think most of us don't see our stories as very special, but it's definitely special. There is a comment from somebody who's watching, and she says, "Thank you, Floyd, for sharing this part of Winters history. When my family moved to Winters in 1965, our foreman was Charlie, I think it's Hamakawa. I did not realize that he was a community leader for the Japanese community in Winters. So many of our families were touched by the Japanese families, and this exhibit opened our eyes to what they went through. Thank you again." So that's a comment. A question, it looks like this might be to me. Is the Yolo County Archives working to build their own collection surrounding the Japanese/Japanese Americans who lived in Yolo County? How would people here consider having their family historical documents, photos, ephemera preserved? So the Yolo County Archives are collecting mission by Emily, thank you. The Yolo County Archives collecting mission and scope is we are the official repository for county records, and then we take in any material that really has to do with Yolo County history. So we're not actively collecting Japanese or Japanese American history, but we are always open to having those types of documents in that record in the collection. As Floyd mentioned, he did donate that wonderful panoramic photograph to our collection that was taken at the opening ceremony for the Japanese school in Winters. So yeah, we're not out in the community soliciting or anything, but we would obviously take anything that anyone was interested in giving that's relevant to the history of Yolo County. And then the second part of your question, if you're asking how could people consider having their documents preserved in their homes, there's a couple of ways that you can preserve documents in your own family collections. And I would be willing to give that information maybe in an email. That might be easier, but high level, I would say one thing that people need to consider is not having photographs in those albums where the picture sticks down. And then also making sure that your paper documents are in the right archival enclosures. So you want to have acid-free enclosures so that it can be preserved. And if you have digital photographs, that's a whole nother story. But that's high level. I think a lot of people are curious about photographs and things like scrapbooks and newspaper. But yeah, you can shoot me an email. I'll put my email address into the chat, and you can send me an email and I can give you some more specific information. And then if you are concerned about the long-term preservation of your materials and it's Yolo County related and you would like to donate it to us, we obviously can consider bringing it into our collection and preserving it for long-term and making it available to the public. So I'm trying to multitask here, but I'll put my email address, and then you can shoot me an email if you have a specific question about your particular family items. Some more thank yous. Thanks so much, Floyd and Emily. This is a fascinating story of resilience and strength in the face of horrendous unkindness. Please keep sharing this message. And then Sac State, Julie Thomas, the archivist there, said Sac State's Japanese American archival collection is always seeking donations from the Sacramento area. So if you have materials that are not Yolo County related, but Sacramento related, Sac State would love to have your stuff in the Japanese American archival collection. I did have another question for you, Floyd, if you have the time. I was curious, you talked a lot about the Japanese American involvement in agriculture, but I was curious, when more women started coming over in, after 1907, were they also participating in the agricultural work, or were they doing other forms of work in the county?
Well, most of the Japanese lived out on the farms, not in town. And it's because in 1915, Winters became a segregated community, and Japanese could only live in one small section of town right by the railroad bridge, which is where the current community center is. And so the women, wives were dispersed out on the farms, and really their main job, to tell the truth, was really to have kids and to raise them up. But they did a lot of, farm work, work on the farms, and they also did a lot of domestic service to the owners in some instances, cooking and cleaning and things like that. But it really was the coming of the East Bay women that really brought culture and music and poetry and refinement to the roughneck East Bay boys that came in, and I think that's where the real cultural life of the community came, with the women.
Thank you so much. And then I was also hoping, I've heard the story before, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what happened in Winters post-World War II, and when the Japanese, that 20% did come back to Winters.
Well, first of all, one of the reasons, another reason why only 20% came back was that on VJ Day, when Japan formally surrendered, there was a big celebration on Main Street. And that night, the small Japantown area that, was right next to the railroad bridge in Section 4, was burnt down. And so that just happened to be the time when they were closing the camps, and people had to make a decision where they wanted to go. So that also obviously sent out a negative message to people who were trying to make a decision at that time. And even when my parents came back, there was signs up around city limits to where it said no more Japs. So, but people calmed down after about 2 or 3 years, and I was born in 1948, and by the time I went to kindergarten, in 1953 or 1954, I think people had gotten over this wartime hysteria, and so things were a lot better. And in our exhibit, we not only talk about the bad times, but we do highlight several of the Winters residents who refused to sign the petitions, in keeping the Japanese out, and actually invited the Japanese back onto their farms to resume their, their work there. So, in Winters, I think really the growers actually, they're interested in having labor and qualified labor, and so they never really were advocates of kicking everybody out. They always felt like that was overkill, and but really it's more the other laborers, from, and then people who had, when the Japanese left, other people came in and took over their jobs and their positions on the farm, and so they had an economic interest in not having the Japanese come back because they felt that they might be displaced again. So but after that immediate period, 4 or 5 years, things went back more to normal, and I had a good experience in grammar school and in high school. Like you pointed out, I was elected Youth Day mayor, but actually before me, another one of my brother's friends was elected Youth Day mayor, and 2 years after me, a person named Stanley Cato from the Cato family was elected Youth Day mayor. So, and another person from the Cato family was elected student body president in like 1958 or so. So, you know, things changed, and you know, I think one of the stories, bylines or lessons that I have is that, you know, when people are scared, particularly when they're afraid that they're going to be invaded, sometimes, you know, good people do bad things, and it's usually, you know, when they feel threatened. And so, you know, once the threat went away, I think a lot of the animosity kind of melted away at the same time. And, but, you know, my parents never talked about it, or even, you know, some of my friends' parents, you know, they never talked about it either. So it's kind of like people just decided that they're going to face the future, and let's not think about that bad thing that happened. So that's why, you know, they say ignorance is bliss. And so I was pretty blissful until I went to UC Davis and actually learned about what really did happen. So.
Right. Well, and to your point, I know you didn't speak about it much in this presentation, but the expertise that the Japanese Americans had in the pruning of the trees, I'm sure that a lot of the growers wanted to have that expertise back after the war.
Yeah, you know, the Japanese have always been good with knives and scissors and pruning shears. You know, I don't know why, but you know, it probably came out of their history of making swords and things like that. But they're very good at that. But and also their gardening. If you've ever been to a Japanese garden, they try and make it look natural, but it's really very unnatural in a way. But the way they prune and everything is pretty marvelous. And if you see the little bonsai plants that they have, where they just snip, 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 and I mean, some of those are like 50 or 60 years old. You know, so the patience that goes into that. You know, they really learn how to work with nature, and that had something to do with their whole method of pruning. They knew how to prune, you know, technically how to cut branches and everything, so that it uses the least amount of effort, and they kept their pruning shear very sharp, and because I used to watch the people came to prune on our farm, and I always felt like they were like great swordsmen, and they all had their own equipment, their little knives and pruning shears, the big ones and smaller ones, but the way they handled that was just amazing. How that they could go up that ladder and do pruning. But you know, talking about pruning is that Professor Tufts, who was one of our neighbors who helped us come back, was head of the pomology department at UC Davis. And so he attacked pruning from a scientific standpoint about how to shape the tree and all of that. But technically, you know, he worked with the Japanese pruners, and they came up with something called the Winters method of pruning apricot trees. And it was a combination of science and also kind of learned skilled from Japan. So, we always talk about the meeting of East and West, and it's done on this big macro level. But in Winters, it really was this relationship between the Brink brothers and other farmers in the area, and a very small part of Wakayama. Almost everybody came from maybe 2 villages that were only like 2 miles apart. And so it really was the tale of 2 little towns, who, for a lot of accidental reasons, they bonded, and they had this mutual interest that for about 50 or 100 years was very productive, I think, on both sides.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It looks like we have one final question, Floyd, if you have some time. So
Sure.
This person says, thank you so much for this presentation. Did splitting the Japanese American community of Winters into 2 different internment camps based on county of residence have lasting ramifications after World War II? I don't know if you've run into any stories about that.
Well, I think it was sad that it was done that way, but when you have a situation where 80% of the people don't come back, but of the 20 that did, it was pretty even on both sides. I don't think that the fact that half went to Arizona and half went to Colorado, was the big made any big difference. But it does show the way the military does things. There's no finesse to it. They just look at a map and they say everybody on one side goes here and people on the other side go someplace else. And there's no exceptions. That's just the way that they did things. But ironically, from the redress standpoint, the one good thing that the military does is it keeps very good records of everybody. Their name, their camp number, the day they walked into camp, the day they went out, where they came from, where they signed out to. And so when it came to finding the people who were incarcerated, I mean, it was a very easy thing to contact people and then to verify whether you're in camp or not in camp. So, sometimes the system works for you and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, and to plug archives, that's probably an archival record that you were looking at to try to get that information. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Floyd, and we'll say thank you to Emily again, even though that she left a little bit early. Thank you so much, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and weekend.
Thank you.